Now. Welcome everybody. We're so excited to have you here today for our webinar, How to Advance Climate Action with Federal Funding. My name is Aaliyah and I'm going to be your host and moderator. I'm a consultant and marketing and communications director at SSG. We're a climate planning consultancy and we work with communities across the United States as well as Canada and South America. We have a great lineup of speakers for you today. They're going to be sharing details about funding opportunities and also the nitty-gritty of climate action planning and how those two can come together. So the way this section is structured, they're all going to be giving short presentations and for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to get into a Q&A period. During the presentations, you can ask any questions you have on the chat. Our team will be monitoring them to raise later on during the Q&A period. And once the presentations are complete, you're also welcome to answer your questions verbally. So, we'll give you a chance to use the raise hand function and unmute yourself, and we can engage in a bit of a discussion. So without further ado, we're going to get started with a presentation from Kate Johnson. Kate is the head of U.S. Federal Affairs at C40 Cities, and her work focuses on advancing U.S. federal policy to support cities in achieving their climate goals. She and her colleagues have put together a guide on federal funding opportunities for climate action for municipalities. My colleague Emmy is going to share a link in the chat to this guide, and now I'm going to hand it over to Kate to tell you all about federal funding.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks to SSG for organizing this webinar today. So I'm Kate Johnson again, I'm with C40 Cities. For those of you who don't know us, we're a network of about 100 cities around the world working to advance ambitious climate action. We have 14 cities here in the US, but through our partners, climate mayors, we actually, when it comes to implementing the Inflation Reduction Act, have been working with hundreds of cities around the US. And so I've been tasked with providing a pretty broad overview of the Inflation Reduction Act and the funding that is available. And so I'm going to rely on the guide that we put out last year with climate mayors. And I can't get into the hundreds of programs in detail. So I'm hoping to give a little bit of an orientation to the guide so that you know where to look to try to get more information on some of the programs that are most interest to you. I saw from the chat we have pretty wide-ranging interests, everything from climate adaptation and nature-based solutions to community development. So hopefully we can help provide resources to all of you. So just starting with the really big picture, where do the dollars go in the Inflation Reduction Act? So there's over $369 billion of incentives in the legislation. And these charts attempt to kind of show two different ways of looking at where this funding is flowing. One is by sector. So that's where you see by far the largest sector that is receiving funding through the Inflation Reduction Act is energy supply. So that's, solar, wind, clean energy generation. And the other way to look at the funding is, what is the mechanism that the funding is flowing through? And I think this is where the Inflation Reduction Act is really unique, say from a sort of typical federal spending bill. And it's because of this that the approaches that we're encouraging local governments to take are different than they might be with just a typical spending bill. So you can see from this pie chart, the lion's share of the funding is actually in the form of tax credits, rather than maybe the competitive grants that folks are used to from the federal government. That is a big piece of it, but by far and away the largest sort of mechanism through which the funding is going to flow are tax credits to businesses and then also to individuals. Go to the next slide. So two cross-cutting opportunities that I want to highlight up front from the Inflation Reduction Act are how it was structured to advance both economic inclusion and equity. So starting with economic inclusion, the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act create a really strong incentive for businesses to create good, high-paying jobs through paying prevailing wages and providing apprenticeships. So all of the tax credits listed here have a bonus credit. So you get even more money back if you follow good labor practices. And that's, we're already starting to see that having a potential impact, and the IRS has put out guidance around some of this already. You can go to the next slide. And on equity in particular, so the Inflation Reduction Act falls under an initiative of the Biden administration called Justice 40, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. But it's the administration's commitment to direct at least 40% of the overall benefit from federal investments in climate and clean energy to disadvantaged communities. And so that target applies to the programs in the Inflation Reduction Act. So as local governments, what you can look at is, there are mapping tools available now that show you how to track, which communities meet the definition of disadvantaged communities. And then you can commit yourself locally to spending, at least 40% of the federal funding that you're able to secure in helping, those frontline communities and organizations. So just two high-level cross-cutting things to keep in mind that, really go across all of these programs. You can go to the next slide. So just to orient local governments to how to approach the Inflation Reduction Act, what the guide does is lays out several strategic roles that we think local governments, local leaders, those working with local governments can play when it comes to implementing the act. And this is, again, where it's a little bit unique. So most big federal spending bills, we would just be telling you to apply for funding or take advantage of funding that was coming to you via formula. Because of the tax credits and some of the the bonus incentives from the Inflation Reduction Act, and the fact that some of the funding is flowing directly to businesses, to individuals, to community-based organizations, we're really encouraging local leaders to think more broadly about their role. So in addition to applying for funding, look at how you can protect against the detrimental impacts of newer continuing fossil fuel facilities. So unfortunately, from a climate perspective, there were some problematic provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that could support, continuing the use of fossil fuels. So as a local government, you can help protect against that. You can also support and partner with frontline communities and the community-based organizations that work within them to help center their priorities in the funding you're applying for, but also to help them secure resources as well, since some of the funding is directly available to communities. You can assist your businesses and individuals in your cities to access the tax credits that were created or modified under the Act. You can help streamline permitting processes. So we're going to see a lot of interest in installing rooftop solar, for example, as a result of the incentives, or doing building energy retrofits. And so local governments have a role, in looking at their permitting process for those things. And then finally, just engaging and coordinating. And I know that we'll talk about that in a lot more detail in the context of the climate pollution reduction grants. So you can go to the next slide. So what the guide does is it breaks down the various funding programs by sort of key sectors from the perspective of climate action. And then we also show, because again, it's a little unique and a little complex how the funding is flowing. So for each of those sectors, we show what local governments are directly eligible for, what individuals and businesses are eligible for, where the money is going to state or tribal governments, and then finally, what's available to community-based organizations. And as you can see from this chart, there are a lot of programs that there are multiple different types of entities are eligible for. And so again, that's where actually engaging and coordinating with folks at the state level and with your community organizations is going to be really important. So this slide shows the programs that are targeting air quality and greenhouse gas reduction broadly. And the biggest one here probably is the climate pollution reduction grants, which we'll talk about more in a minute. Go to the next slide. And this slide shows the funding that's available for housing and commercial buildings, so energy efficiency and electrification and retrofits. You'll see here Most of the incentives are those tax credits that individuals and businesses are going to be eligible for. But critically, those tax credits are also open to local governments now, thanks to the creation of a mechanism for organizations and governments that don't pay taxes to take advantage of the value of those tax credits. We'll say we're still waiting on guidance from the Treasury Department on how that will actually work. But that's a level of nuance and complication that our nice infographics, it's hard to convey, but just keep that in mind. You can go to the next slide. I noted in the chat there is a lot of interest in adaptation and resilience. So these are the programs that can help fund resilience projects, including urban tree canopy, environmental and climate justice block grants that community-based organizations are eligible for, and then some targeted programs around coastal issues and water as well. And then the Inflation Reduction Act provides a lot of funding for clean electric vehicles. I will note that there is not funding, or at least not much funding in the Inflation Reduction Act for alternative transportation options like transit, walking, and cycling. But the bipartisan infrastructure law, or the Investment and Jobs Act, which passed prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, does have quite a few grant programs for those purposes. So it's not captured in our guide, but I just wanted to note that there is additional funding for those strategies. Go to the next slide. And then I wanted to note workforce development because it's a little bit different. So I think workforce development is critical to all of the sectors that I just went through, but there are only a very small number of programs in the Inflation Reduction Act that are directly targeted at funding workforce development programs. But workforce development is an eligible use of a lot of the programs. So I would say think of it as a critical enabling strategy, really, that cuts across a lot of the different programs. And then also noted here are the tax credits that are increased if you follow good labor practices or do apprenticeship programs, which is also part of a workforce development strategy. And then finally, I, as I said at the top, do not have time to go through every single program, but what the guide does is it provides a summary table by sector of each program, who's administering it, some of the timelines, and now this came out last year, so some of these sort of next steps have already been met, and then who is eligible. So that's a really good snapshot by sector, and so you can kind of scroll through these. So again, air quality and greenhouse gas reduction, housing and commercial buildings. The next one is resilience. Then we have clean vehicles and workforce development. And then this is my final slide. So for each of those programs where the table gives a snapshot, we have a more in-depth description of each program. And so this example is for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. You can see it's $27 billion over 2 years. It's being administered by the EPA. And we still expect a funding availability notice in Q1, although it's running out of time. But EPA has made announcements on that program. And then again, you can see there's a more detailed description. And then for each program, we highlight the opportunities for environmental justice, sort of tying back again to that Justice 40 goal. So how can you use this program to address environmental justice issues in your community? And then finally, potential local government roles for each of the programs. So even those that aren't funding flowing directly to local governments, we provide some suggestions for how to approach that funding. And I think the link to the full guide is in the chat, but I'm also happy to answer any questions when we get to the end.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was a really great comprehensive overview. And I definitely recommend that if you're a local government, please do check out the guide. There are really comprehensive and useful tables in there, like the ones that Kate was just showing. So next up is my colleague, Carol Fraser. Carol is an urban planner and a sustainable design specialist. They work as a lead analyst on diverse projects at SSG, including statewide decarbonization projects for the states of Oregon and Washington, as well as climate action plans for cities ranging from Denton, Texas to Bellingham, Washington. So Carol is going to be sharing some guidelines from a climate action planning guidebook that we recently developed for US communities. Emmy is going to share a link to that in the chat so you can have it for reference. And now I'd like to hand it over to Carol.
Thanks, Aaliyah, and thank you, Kate, for that overview. So I'm going to dive in now to one particular opportunity presented by the Inflation Reduction Act. And if you were coming to see Yul Herbert, apologies, I am not Yul, but I am filling in for him today. He had an unexpected conflict. So without further ado, to discuss the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, that's CPRG. This program really aims to position cities, states, territories, and tribes to be able to make some of those transformative investments that Kate was referencing with the support of IRA funding programs. So it's an enormous opportunity that's part of that overarching $27 billion. That provides funding for both non-competitive planning grants and competitive implementation grants to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So in total, there's $250 million for the allocated competitive planning grants and $4.6 billion for the implementation grants. These grants are going to states. Each state is eligible to get $3 million each. And as of the deadline, all but 4 states applied. So they will be getting that money. And then 67 of the largest cities in the US, actually MSA areas. So they're getting $1 million each. And if you're wondering, well, I'm not part of a state government, I'm not part of one of those large MSAs, what's in it for my community? The idea with the state grants is that smaller municipalities may be able to work with their state government to access some of that funding. The EPA is requiring that state governments collaborate with smaller districts and large and small municipalities to conduct meaningful engagement and be generally a part of what's going on in terms of state level planning. And if you're a municipality that doesn't get some of these allocated funding chunks right now, you're still eligible to apply for the CPRG implementation funding a little later, even if you didn't get a planning grant. And then finally, the way they've designed the entire program is that these are regionally focused planning grants for the MSA level. They are encouraging and in some ways even requiring intra-regional cooperation. So if you're a smaller municipality that's part of a larger MSA, you may have an opportunity to work with an entity, an overarching kind of regional entity that has access to the funding. As I mentioned, there's also funding for tribes and US territories. There's $25 million for climate planning grants for federally recognized tribes. Each tribe can receive up to $500,000 each. And then there are the territories as well eligible for planning grants at this time. The implementation grants are going to be posted later. The application guidelines will be posted later in 2023. And as I mentioned, that kind of totally is a huge amount of funding, $4.6 billion compared to the planning grants. So really, this is just the beginning of what's available. And it's kind of a unique, once in a generation, maybe once in a lifetime opportunity to create implementable financing ready for climate plans across the US. Basically, this opportunity just kind of never happens. And if it's done well, it can really give communities of all sizes a roadmap for how to achieve their GHG reduction targets, but it'll also spark all sorts of economic and social benefits, such as job creation and improvements in public health. So if you are one of the states, the tribes, or the 67 MSAs or territories that's getting this funding, you have 2 key deliverables that you're expected to show the EPA as a result of this funding. So the first one is a little sooner. They're staggered, so you have time to work on each of them. And it's really just to get you started, have a GHG inventory, quantify the GHG reduction measures, do some equity analysis, and review, whose kind of authority there is to implement a broad strokes implementation plan. The second deliverable, you go into more detail and you have until mid-2025 to deliver that, where they really want to see essentially a more detailed analysis of all of those things, as well as what your plan is to leverage other federal funding, so some of the funding that Kate mentioned, and that workforce planning analysis, that's really key. The funding can actually be used to create these deliverables. The funding can be used for so many different kinds of costs. It can cover staffing, hiring new folks, or contracting for staff. It can pay for planning and implementing meetings, workshops, essentially any kind of engagement or outreach. And you can allocate that funding to municipalities. You can make subawards to municipalities, air pollution control agencies, regional planning agencies, NGOs, community organizations, even universities. So there is a lot of leeway in terms of how you would use this funding to create these products. You can also use it for modeling, for studies, for evaluation and metrics tracking, for training, supplies, etc. So for a federal program, it's pretty open to what we're usually seeing. So if we go to the next slide, we want to give you an overview of how CPRG can kind of fit into what is happening in the world of climate planning. It's evolved over time. We would like to see the deliverables and the plans that are produced as part of CPRG plan grant funding to really align with the state of the art. So you can see on this graph that we've put together how the complexity of plans has evolved over time. And starting about 30 years ago with GHG inventories and basic targets, you see climate plans that are kind of a laundry list of actions. It's kind of the first generation. With the second generation, and as climate change has become more of an urgent and kind of politically at the front issue, cities, standardized accounting rules. That's when we see the GHG protocol. They set net zero targets by 2040 or 2050. They started using Excel-based models to develop scenarios for GHG reduction and to prioritize actions, and equity is an increasingly important theme. So that's the second generation. We're seeing some of those initial deliverables with CPRG kind of being in between those two areas. But there's an opportunity with this funding to really go beyond the basics. So looking at what kind of the third generation of climate action planning, it's about seriousness and it's about a more comprehensive approach. So going beyond a kind of standard GHG inventory, it's really looking under the hood, so to speak, at what are the activities that are driving emissions in cities or driving energy use. So using an activity-based inventory becomes really key, and even using an activity-based model to look at different scenarios. Aligning targets with science, the latest science from IPCC, incorporating resilience into the actions that reduce emissions, so combining mitigation and adaptations becomes increasingly important, and then using a spatial approach and a spatial model to link climate action to land use planning and transportation infrastructure. Again, becoming more sophisticated about where the actions are taking place and how they're interacting to reduce emissions over time. And then, of course, tying it all together, having an implementation plan that shows that your community and your city are investment ready, and at a whole level where you've engaged the entire city in the process. And then finally, the things that are emerging in this practice, that many cities that are part of C40 network and other cities across the globe are implementing, they're looking at things beyond operational emissions. So in the previous 3 generations, there's a focus on what kind of uses energy to operate in the moment, but looking at embodied carbon that's in the building materials in cities and reducing the emissions that way, that's also becoming a major focus. Looking at how cities can coordinate with their utilities and integrating utility planning with city climate action planning. They kind of speak different languages, so bridging that divide is becoming increasingly crucial. And then developing carbon budgets. That's an innovative way of operationalizing some of those long-term targets that are a bit abstract, and really looking at, in every decision that a city is making, how can they make sure that they're moving towards their greenhouse gas emission reduction goal. And finally, quantifying the risks of climate adaptation that helps to justify specific investments to reduce emissions and increase resilience. So we're really seeing all of those things as being a key part of the plans that are most ready for funding and also most implementable, have the highest chance of success of being implemented. So if we're serious about deep emissions reductions, we feel that at SSG, we feel that a climate action plan needs to address 4 specific questions. Right now, climate action plans are really only focusing on the first question, really important question: how do we reduce emissions? So this becomes the pathway, right, that the city or community can take. But there are 3 other important questions. The next one being, how much will it cost to implement this plan, and how much money can potentially be saved? This is an economic analysis, again, the whole city, a whole picture of the pathway. Where are the kind of reductions in energy use going to save money over time, or investments in retrofits are going to save money over time? Those kind of calculations can be really crucial for passing the plan, and then also aligning funding sources so you can implement the plan. Of course, actually spelling out who will do what, the implementation strategy, that is another key question. And then finally, where will the money come from? So identifying up front some of the great opportunities that are out there, federal level, state level, potentially, depending on where you are, and actually putting that down in writing and making it really clear where you intend to get the funding to finance the pathways. So in terms of designing a pathway, the approach that we recommend is as follows. And this is because climate action is going to require significant change in the community, in any community. I'm sure many of you on the call realize that already. But these changes are going to result in benefits as well as trade-offs. And engagement and broad participation in the planning process can really help a community understand what those trade-offs can potentially be, and can define what that pathway of change is going to look like for each community, which is unique and has its own considerations. So doing a really robust engagement process alongside your technical analysis can ensure that this transition that's going to be happening over the next 30 years and longer is going to be equitable, it's going to be a just transition, and you're also going to have a wide base of support and of what your plan is, support for your plan, and even understanding of why what's in there is there, and what's going to happen, what it's going to take to implement it. So we recommend a process that looks something like this. Oh, just one back, thanks. And you really take the city and the community along a journey of this climate action plan. So if you look at the top, that's kind of the technical analysis, the bottom being the engagement, and everywhere you see those wheels turning, those arrows turning, that represents a feedback loop. So when you're doing an inventory, you're engaging the community, you're talking to them about the targets that are being set, the various actions, understanding what their priorities are, or what existing resources may be in terms of how you design the actions, all the way through implementation, and then monitoring and evaluating the plan. So we really recommend having a process where there's kind of a constant back and forth, or a bit of a back and forth at least, between the technical and the engagement. This ensures that the technical analysis is informed by local knowledge, and that the people who are involved in the process actually develop their own capacity, right? They're going to be the ones around to implement the plan, or through their community organization or city staff. So you want to make sure that they're gaining more sophisticated understanding of what's in the plan and what's possible in the future. It's really complicated to understand the dynamics of a community and how GHG emissions are occurring, and then how to reduce them over time. It's really beyond the understanding of one person's brain, at least the ones we know. So we recommend using a model so that you can actually have a whole city picture of the activities going on in a given place. Like something like this to show all the different interactions in the model between commercial energies, residential energies, etc. So the model that we use, we carve up the city into zones, geospatial zones, put people in homes in each zone. We track how they might travel between zones using transportation planning data. And then the model tracks how people use energy, where that energy is coming from, how waste is produced, et cetera. It sums all this up and calculates the overall emissions for that year, as well as energy consumption, energy costs, capital costs, et cetera. And then when you do scenario planning and you have a model like this, really allows you to explore different futures. So you can put people in different zones, in different types of buildings, in different trip lengths to where they go to work, and see what the impact on emissions would be. So for many projects, we've used the model to evaluate the impact of expanded bus service, greenhouse gas, emission reduction of new EV infrastructure, household retrofit or weatherization programs, et cetera. As I mentioned before, equity is a really, really important piece of climate action planning. And we see kind of 4 key steps that are involved in ensuring that equity is at the heart of your climate action plan and the pathway that you design. So first, making sure that you go into the process knowing that people have a voice and that they can use that voice. So we enable equity-seeking groups to define how they would like to be involved through doing a pre-engagement process. So before you even start engaging, interviewing folks, understanding what's worked about previous engagement, what should be different this time, making sure that they can have a say in how that process is designed. Evaluating the context with an equity and climate justice lens to identify social vulnerability, specific neighborhood vulnerability and risk. Then you want to quantify the impacts on equity. For example, you may have an action around increasing electric heat pump uptake, but that may have implications for low-income households who can't afford to switch and might be stuck using natural gas as prices increase over time. So that could be an important thing to address in your plan, how you as a city or your partners might address those kind of potential inequities. Or look at energy poverty, both now and potentially in the future. Energy poverty, which can lead to discomfort from drafty homes or increase in incidences of respiratory illness, these other kind of public health impacts. Look at ways that you can reduce the cost of energy or what people are spending over time. And that really comes through in the final step around embedding equity into your actions and your implementation, being guided by what local organizations are providing in terms of context, and think about geographic and neighborhood targeting and cultural and linguistic considerations. So the final result can look, in terms of a pathway, can look something like this, a wedge diagram. And this shows the relative importance of each action in terms of how much it's able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions over time. So there are also dependencies to think about when designing a pathway. EVs can only result, adoption of electric vehicles can only result in deep emission reductions if there's clean electricity available. Heat pumps may only be cost effective if houses are made more efficient through retrofits and so on. So thinking about the layering of these things in your pathway is really crucial. So for the second question, how much will it cost or save? This is where an economic analysis becomes really important. And detailed financial analysis like the one you see here can really help make the case for climate action. Certainly there are upfront costs, but it's helpful to highlight when these costs start to look like returns over time, when that kind of investment pays off, and also, in what year can these investments be expected to be made? How many jobs will be generated in each sector, et cetera. So it's a key part of the CPRG plans that you have a detailed economic analysis, because they want these plans to really make the case and kind of make some momentum around climate planning. And it allows us also, doing this kind of analysis, to see the kind of role that the IRA funding, a lot of what Kate mentioned, what role it can have in implementing the cap. So we're going to hear a little later from Amanda from Lakewood about how that is playing out in a specific municipality. So for those reasons, we say at SSG that a climate action plan is essentially an economic development strategy. And that's what the IRA is too. There's a moral imperative to act on climate change. That's why a lot of us are passionate about this work. But these plans are not only about reducing emissions, they're also about future-proofing your community, and really playing an active role in making sure that the transition is just, and enabling that community to proactively plot a course through this transition that advances equity, that improves health outcomes, that improves quality of life. So in other words, you have an opportunity to make a climate plan, but really it's a city plan for a better future overall. In terms of, you've got your pathway together, coming up with that implementation strategy, mapping out the actions, the investments to people and organizations, figuring out who's going to do which projects, who's going to pay for them, what's the role of municipality versus businesses or individual households. So it's important to think about what can the city's role be most strategically, potentially most efficiently. We like to think about the city being a quarterback in football, which I am not very familiar with, so I might be getting this really wrong, but quarterback can plot out the play, it can make key lobs, it can set the strategy for that player for the game. So the municipality can play a similar role. It can kind of have a coordinator role, a convener role, a regulator, a funder, bringing some of those funding sources to other organizations that can't access it directly, an incentivizer, or just overall a leader setting the course, setting the tone. So the mix is different in each community. Who's going to do what? It's not going to be the same everywhere, depending on your resources and your culture. So it's really critical that the community writ large takes ownership during that process, during the engagement of defining the roles. Cities can't do everything, but you can really be a quarterback and take it as far as you can. And of course, states have a lot of power too. So just to sum up, around the financing plan and to kind of tee up what Amanda is going to talk about, there are many ways that climate action can be funded. Some of them are just through doing the action themselves. So we look at a lot of the efficiency gains of using less energy, using energy that is more affordable, or that's produced in a different way. That can result in savings over time. Energy generation, as I just mentioned, and then of course, there's these new opportunities. There's so much in the IRA, the tax credits and rebates especially for low and moderate income households, in addition to everything that's going to states and municipalities. And then there's additional federal acts that have been passed, like the Infrastructure Act. So setting up a plan that really answers these questions comprehensively will set you up to access all of that funding in a really competitive way. Again, it's going to be competitive grants. You'll stand out from the crowd. So we want to make sure you check out our guide, and then I'll hand it back to Aaliyah.
Thank you so much, Carol, for that really comprehensive overview. I'm sure we'll have more time to kind of dive into it during the question period. So next up, last but not least, we have Amanda Cramer. Amanda is a city planner at the City of Lakewood, and she's been working in local government and community development organizations for over 8 years. And Amanda is going to be sharing Lakewood's experience in developing a climate action plan that accounts for Inflation Reduction Act funding. So welcome, Amanda.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, everybody. Thank you, Kate and Carol, for your very comprehensive presentations. So a lot of what both of the previous speakers spoke about is what is put into play here in the City of Lakewood. Again, my name is Amanda Cramer. I'm a city planner for the City of Lakewood. Among a few people, I was a lead on this project for the city. We are, if you're not familiar, in the greater Cleveland metropolitan area, a first-ring suburb of Cleveland. Population is holding steady at about 50,000 people. We are the densest city in the state. We have about 50,000 people in 5 square miles. So a lot of people in a small space, especially for Ohio standards. Our environment can be subject to flooding, some extreme temperatures in the winter, both ways, considering we had spring half the time in the winter and winter half the time in the spring. Some subject to some storms, generally not subject to, the larger scale destructive events like a tornado, just because of how urbanized we are. So this graph shows our business as planned projection with our CO2 emissions going to 323.7 kilotons, and in US terms, that's about 714 million pounds. And that's by 2050. And that's again, if we stay on our business as planned projection. And most of those decreases are due to the warming climate requiring less heating of our buildings. Most of our community is residential, so that is a big user. And when we implement the low carbon scenario that we worked with SSG on, we are at 9.1 kilotons for our CO2, which is just over 2 million pounds by 2050. So obviously the status quo is not really going to be working super well for us at this point, and there's huge room for improvement. So the 4 big moves that people were talking about before. We are in the finally getting this to our city council next week actually. So we have not begun implementation yet. We are excited to get things going. Implementation is going to be focusing on these big themes instead of the really specific minute details. Again, just to be more comprehensive, and as Carol mentioned, making it more of a community plan as opposed to just a little bit here, a little bit there. So just trying to be comprehensive about it. The 4 themes are buildings, transportation, local renewable energy, and water and waste. So how we get there, this is that wedge diagram that we were talking about. This shows the various ways that we're able to cut our carbon footprint by decarbonizing many of our systems in place, like electrifying our municipal fleet. Rooftop solar installations have gotten a lot more popular in the community, commercial retrofits, and probably the biggest contributor that we found was residential buildings. Most of our homes here are over 100 years old. Not really super efficient, mine included. And then also a big contributor is just, people using their car and gasoline use. So the analysis here shows the net present value of investments versus the operational and maintenance savings. The energy savings, which almost equals the capital cost over the lifetime. So that's what Carol was talking about before about, it really does pay for itself in energy savings, not to mention the sooner you do it, the sooner you're able to achieve those savings. And then also the renewable energy revenue. So again, that's actually going to save us money. And if we were to utilize the Inflation Reduction Act, we could potentially, save $342 million over 30 years if everyone in Lakewood was to take advantage of this. So that's a super big number there that is really scary to put out there, that the initial investments about $1 billion in capital expenditures. Again, as you all know, this is going to be a long game. It's not something that we're going to see overnight. Our original goal with some of our plans was to be to have a lower carbon footprint, almost a zero carbon footprint by 2035, but it's just not feasible for us. So this was something that we were able to work out, and that's the price tag of it up front. So both of these graphs show where those capital expenditures would take place. The graph on the left-hand side shows just how those costs would be distributed if we were to pay everything up front in cash, which I don't foresee us doing. It would average around 60 million a year, and that's mostly due to the retrofitting of the buildings. The graph on the right shows the capital expenses would look like annually if we were to take out loans and amortize the cost, which again is most likely the case. And those payments would obviously continue past 2050. So what's really interesting is that even though there's a considerable amount of spending that needs to happen with the upfront capital costs, again, that's a very big, scary number. We're also able to see a lot of the savings from these investments, most particularly in operation and maintenance savings, energy savings, the social cost of carbon. Again, as Carol mentioned before, we have pockets of our city that are much more prone to certain respiratory issues and things like that because of where they live, and they are paying that social cost. So we're trying to address that as well with our plan. Equity was a huge component of our plan as well. But especially in the case of energy savings, that, you know, again, the sooner we get to these, the more savings we're going to be able to experience over that 30-year period. And you know, the urgency is very clear for all of us of that, you know, this is something we need to act on quickly, even if it is long term. So when we do add up all these savings, we can see that Lakewood's going to offset all of our capital costs of implementing, actually save $54 million over about 30 years by implementing our plan. And that's without the Inflation Reduction Act. So if we were to layer in the funds from that for individual households to implement changes, and these are for, you know, anything from an electric vehicle to building retrofits, we go from saving $54 million to $342 million. So the net present value with the IRA tax credit is pretty hard to argue. But that's all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions from our point of view, but again, SSG is the professional as far as the understanding of the background work, but I'm happy to answer anything from a municipality perspective.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It's really great to hear how the things the first two folks presented on are being applied at a local level. So now we're going to open up the floor for questions. And if you would like to, you can verbally ask your question. You could use the raise hand function in Zoom. So we will be able to see that you are wanting to speak. And we can also answer questions from the chat. Emmy, are there any pending questions from the chat?
There are not. There was a clarification question for Kate that Kate responded in the chat, but in case some people missed it, it was about how you can access funding for transportation because it's not covered in the IRA, and it actually is through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and I'll put the link in the chat again.
Awesome. Thank you, Emmy. So the floor is open. If you have a question, please ask it in the chat or raise your hand. There's a function on Zoom, which is a little raise hand symbol. If you have trouble finding that, it's okay. You can also just unmute yourself. Okay, we have a question from Shad, and that is, are municipalities able to apply multiple times across priority sections for the Inflation Reduction Act? Kate, I'll hand it over to you first, and then either of the other panelists can chime in if they'd like.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it depends a little bit on the program. So some of the programs are sort of one-time infusions of funding, including the climate pollution reduction grants that Carol went through. So the implementation funding, which will be announced next year, will kind of be a one-time competition. But on the other hand, all of the tax credits are pretty much uncapped. So once we have a better understanding of how the direct pay mechanism will work to enable local governments to access those tax credits, and that guidance is expected maybe this week, maybe next week, we keep hearing very soon. The idea is that any project that meets the eligibility for those tax credits, you would be able to utilize that funding stream for.
Thank you, Kate. Amanda or Carol, did you have anything to add?
No, thank you, Kate. I think that pretty much covers it. I think I was just wanting to highlight that, yeah, that implementation funding that I brought up, it's such a huge amount. I wouldn't be surprised if there's multiple rounds of application. I don't know, Kate, if you've heard about that, but all that is to say is the guidelines are not out yet, so stay tuned. But as of now, yes, I have the same understanding as Kate that there's kind of no limit to most of these programs.
Yeah, I think on the implementation funding for the CPRG program, we don't know yet, although I do know that EPA is trying to move as expeditiously as possible to get that money out. So we'll see. We expect them some point, I think this summer or later this year, to give a little bit more insight into how they're going to structure that competition. But the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, on the other hand, which you may have heard referred to as the National Green Bank, it goes by many names. EPA actually was required by the legislation to distribute all of that funding by 2024. So that's the $27 billion that I noted. That will move out quickly, but it will move to intermediaries who are then going to be running programs, sort of like we typically see with green banks to, finance building retrofits and solar, et cetera. So again, like the money might be available longer, just maybe not directly from EPA, but through these intermediaries that are funded.
Thank you, Kate. We have a question from Violet.
Hi, thank you. I'm wondering, especially from sort of a case study perspective, I know the numbers make sense and they look like great financial savings in the long term, but I'm wondering from sort of a governance and politics side, what other strategies you have for getting agreement on the plan and how to implement it.
Amanda, do you want to speak to that?
I was going to say, we'll let you know. We did bring this to our full committee, our full city council a few weeks ago, and we're a fairly progressive city. This was not, for the most part, this was very well received by all of our council people. All of them were interested. The only issue was that some of our policies that we were looking at were not progressive enough. So I can't really answer that yet because we haven't finished the process. Again, a lot of this initiative was brought to us with assistance from our council. They were part of our another way to include them is we made them part of our advisory committee. So they designated 2 people to join our advisory committee. So they were able to have their presence be known and heard so that they could voice any concerns that they had, the ones that were particularly concerned about this. But I don't see it being an issue for us just because of the makeup of our council. Again, I would suggest making sure that they're involved from the get-go, especially those that could be critics of it, making them aware of what you're going through. And like, Kate and Carol were saying, letting them know, again, that $1 billion is a very scary number, and that is enough for a lot of people to just say no right away. So making sure that they do understand, the pros and cons of it, as simple as that sounds.
Maybe add to that, Amanda, too, is aligning what you're proposing to take action on with existing community priorities. In some communities that's affordable housing, that's the top issue. In other places it's workforce development or jobs or economic opportunity. So kind of zooming out away from, this is the cost of reducing emissions in our community, but really more, this is the cost of investing in our community to get an outcome that looks like this in 2040, or whichever kind of target year makes sense. And then to Amanda's point, the engagement is really crucial. The emphasis on equity, of course, but also being really clear throughout the process. Here's the decision makers. Here's how we're using input. Here is how all of this is coming together, and really being transparent about how input is being used in the final plan. All of those things can build trust amongst groups and people who maybe have had experiences not trusting each other in the past, and there's that element that I think needs to be kind of front of mind as part of like the first part of what I said too, of like creating a unity or a vision around some other goals that maybe just have broader support already in the community.
Thank you, Amanda and Carol. So I'm seeing a few questions in the chat around getting access to the slide deck or the recording. We are going to be sharing all of this material with webinar attendees. If you registered for the webinar, which I assume everybody on this call has, we will send it out through that email list. So you will definitely get a copy to refer to and share with anyone else who might be interested. So we have a follow-up question from Shad. He says, do you anticipate guidelines requesting or favoring cities with a climate action and adaptation plan already in place? Kate, I'll let you take a stab at that first.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Chad's question's referring specifically to the climate pollution reduction grant program, but that one actually very explicitly says that if you want to be eligible for implementation funding, the strategy that you're applying for funding for has to be covered by one of the plans that was developed in the first phase of the program that we're in right now. But notably, that strategy could be in a state level plan, and you as a local government could apply and perhaps even partner with other local governments in your region to apply to actually, that you are the ones that are going to be implementing that strategy. For example, we know, building retrofits and building policies like that very much happens at the local level. So you could very much see a state level plan talk about the need to electrify buildings, but it's actually local governments that are, applying to implement that, for example. And the EPA has been very clear that they do not expect, since many cities and many states already have climate action plans, they do not expect you to fully redo your plan just because of this program, but that you could, for example, update your plan to do what Lakewood did, and to look at all of the funding available from the Inflation Reduction Act and kind of say, okay, maybe we can accelerate these actions, or now we can, use IRA financing for this piece, and that would fulfill some of the requirements of that planning grant.
Thank you, Kate. So we do have another question, and we can stay a few minutes to address that. But just looking at the time, I want to make sure people who have to go soon can go. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Please, if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We will be sending you all that webinar information from an SSG email, so you can feel free to write to us. And we'll also be sharing links to C40's guide as well. And if you would like to stay up to date with, climate planning insights from SSG, we do have a newswire. Emmy's going to drop a link in the chat to sign up if you're interested. And she's also going to drop a link to a feedback form. So if you can spare a couple of minutes, we'd love your feedback on this webinar, what worked well and what didn't, so we can improve future webinars. We will now go into a few more questions before wrapping up. So we have a question from Sam, who says, how can we address government competitive measurement of alignment of a marginalized community with local government when local government is opposed to the federal government spending objectives? Who would like to take a first stab at this question?
I'm wondering, Sam, if you could provide a little more clarity on what you mean, or a specific example, just so I know how to answer the question better.
I will try. I'm trying to do it safely as well, because we want to be engaged in these programs, but it's probably not unfamiliar among our peers in marginalized, underserved communities that the local politics is not in alignment with the federal spending of these initiatives. So how can, when EPA in particular wants to benchmark our competitive request for proposal, well, how well are you aligned with your local delegation? And that local delegation is elected to oppose spending programs like this. I mean, how can we address that we're open to democratic process, but we can't be in full sync? We'll be in cooperation. We expect our electeds to be in sync with our people. but I don't know, how do you have any, it's a very challenging question. It's a very challenging, complex problem. But I wondered if you had, if you were in touch with how our orgs are dealing with this disconnect.
That's kind of from the perspective of community organizations in a planning context in which the government isn't aligned with the objectives of the CBOs. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Well, I think the federal government spending objectives are very much speaking to it and trying to reach the marginalized communities. But if they're going to benchmark our effectiveness with our alignment with a more localized elected an agency that may be not in sync with the federal program, then, you know, we don't want to lose points on that. We want that should not be a discredit to the marginalized community for continuing to be underserved.
Yeah,
I think that's as far as I can go as an example, but
sure. Yeah, it is really tricky operating in that kind of political environment. Sorry, Kate, did you want to say something? Oh,
I was just saying that my apologies that I actually have to leave because I'm facilitating another meeting that just started at the top of the hour, but I really appreciate everyone's questions. And as I noted, my contact information is on the slides, and please reach out to me if you do have any questions. But I didn't want to cut off the conversation because it was a good one, but thanks everyone.
thank you, Kate. I think just, to kind of answer the question we were in the middle of there, I mean, the one thing that comes to mind is that a lot of the tax credits and rebates, et cetera, that are in the IRA are available, to individual households, and perhaps a role of a CBO in that kind of political jurisdiction can be just improving access to information about what's available to people, regardless of where they live, regardless of what the local government is doing. A lot of that funding kind of comes down at that level. Clearly, there's more to say there, and we're kind of running out of time, but I just wanted to highlight that piece at least. And I don't know if Amanda has something else to add, but
I agree with your statements, Carol.
Thank you, Carol. So now we have another question that has to do with financial analysis from Taylor. So the question is, when performing the economic analysis component, how do you decide how far out in your scenarios to count costs and benefits? Or how do you manage end effects? So I'm going to invite Carol to respond to their question. And our colleague, Jeremy, who has years and years of experience on this, is also on the line. So he'll step in and add anything more after Carol's response.
Yeah, I'm tempted to just hand it over to Jeremy right away. So I think I'm just going to do that.
Okay, I think Jeremy may have left. He was here a few minutes ago.
Funny.
Sorry about that.
Well, I guess the quick answer would be we often align them with the net zero targets, which a lot of communities, it's 2050. But as Amanda mentioned in her presentation, looking at, if you amortize those costs, it's going to extend beyond that date. So we don't necessarily always show how far out that is. I mean, it's already, nearly 30 years in the future. But it's really up to each unique community if that's really useful to show the full cost all the way out until it's fully paid. But I think we've just kind of found that going out until the reduction date, when you've achieved your goals, essentially, is useful for most communities.
Thanks, Carol. I would like to add that for most communities, they have recovered the cost of their initial investment within, I believe, 10 to 15 years. Sometimes it can be as soon as 5. And so generally speaking, if we are looking at targets like net zero by 2050, it's kind of way past the point of recouping their investment. And also in terms of deciding how far out to consider costs and benefits, some communities also ask us to model things for multiple dates in time to understand how different timescales would affect the analysis. So for example, for the City of Toronto, for their climate action plan, we looked at costs and benefits out to 2050 for a net zero by 2050 scenario, and also out to 2040 for a net zero by 2040 scenario. scenario. And the interesting thing was they actually found that their savings and the benefits of the scenario were far better in the 2040 scenario than in the 2050 scenario, which wasn't necessarily inspected. And that kind of shaped how they decided to go about climate action planning after that. So I think we are done questions. There is one more question from Howard that says, is there a way electric bikes and other forms of non-car personal transportation can be made eligible for EV tax credits? Amanda or Carol, I'm not sure if you would know the answer to this question or not.
I do know the answer, and it's unfortunately not, from my understanding. I know there was discussion about including an e-bike tax credit in that area. It got taken out before the bill was ultimately passed. And there are some states, so depending on the state that you're in, there are e-bike credits, or at the local level. It's certainly something I like to encourage municipalities to consider in terms of providing maybe a rebate, not necessarily a tax credit, for e-bikes. But I'm pretty sure it's not eligible. And I've looked into it personally because I was very curious on a personal level, like the definition of vehicle. And I think they've scoped it in a way that unfortunately it's not eligible.
Cool. Well, thank you, Carol. Thank you again also, Amanda, for speaking today. It's been really lovely to have all of you. As I said before, please feel free to reach out to us or to Kate if you have any follow-up questions, and best of luck with your climate action planning.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.